Next, we'll turn it over to Sara Baldwin, who is the Electrification Policy Director at Energy Innovation. Sara will talk about California's regulatory landscape and the implications of that for local governments on municipal buildings. Sara, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thanks, Denise. Good morning, everybody, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. Let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, oh, got ahead of myself there. All right, great. So good morning, and thanks again. It's really an honor to be a part of this conversation. It's very important for a lot of reasons already mentioned. Before I begin, just a little bit of background about Energy Innovation. We are a nonpartisan energy and environmental policy firm. We provide research and analysis to policymakers to help them make informed choices on energy policy. We're headquartered in San Francisco, but I am located in Salt Lake City, Utah. And I've been doing clean energy work across the country for 16 years, focusing on legislative, regulatory, and program solutions needed to decarbonize all sectors of the economy, but with a focus on the energy and electricity sectors in particular. And it's really an honor to participate in this convening of local government leaders working on these issues. So as local government officials, you are tasked with a multitude of responsibilities as you work to serve your communities and citizens. You're also spearheading the movement to decarbonize our economy at the community level, where really so many decisions are made. So before I dive into my content for your leadership and commitment to a healthy, prosperous, and livable future, I really want to start by saying thank you. I know it's no easy task, but I will say that your efforts are getting recognized across the country and even internationally. So even if it feels hard day after day, please know that your work is definitely super critical. And as many of you know, the big lift that's associated with adopting ambitious policy goals really pales in comparison to the work that's required to implement those policies. And the last panelists certainly illustrated those points in detail. But really, at a core level, those policies have to be executed in a way that doesn't compromise other values, such as maintaining affordable services and reliable infrastructure for your communities. And when it comes to buildings, there are a lot of moving parts and factors that impact this push to decarbonize, whether it's for your own buildings, for new construction, or for the residential and commercial buildings that are located throughout your community. Some of these factors are as follows: state policy goals that impact the energy systems and filter down to the local level, such as carbon goals, renewable goals, and efficiency goals. Local zoning, permitting, as well as historic building considerations, all of which impact the types of upgrades to old buildings as well as the parameters for new buildings. Access to funding, financing, and incentives, which determine whether and how you pay for the changes needed. Utility planning and grid infrastructure, whether gas or electric, and how those align or misalign with the local infrastructure needs and plans. Building codes, equipment certifications, and appliance standards, which impact how buildings are designed and the availability of reliable products to meet your policy goals. Off-site and on-site distributed renewable generation and/or energy storage, and the various regulatory levers that impact their economic and technical viability. And finally, the critical importance of ensuring greater community resilience in the context of ever-increasing threats, disasters, and challenges, and the shift to electrify the transportation system, and what buildings need to accommodate and be equipped with in order to support widespread charging infrastructure. So every one of these, and likely others not listed, ultimately influence the buildings throughout your communities. So if your job feels like a little bit like you're trying to make a Rubik's Cube put together, that makes sense. It's definitely a challenge. This forum is dedicated to helping you figure out how to put these pieces together and help you achieve your goals. And I'm gonna just really provide a high level focus and emphasis on the state regulatory factors that are impacting decarbonization at your level. I notice in the chat that there are some representatives from the CEC and possibly CPUC. So I definitely want to encourage you to obviously work directly with and continue to coordinate directly with those folks who are in the trenches in the regulatory spaces in California. So before you can affect any change at any level of government, it's of course important to know which entity does what and is responsible for what. At a high level, the three most prominent regulatory agencies, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but just to recap, you have CARB, which is the state agency charged with monitoring and regulating GHGs and other air pollutants. You have the CPUC, or the California Public Utilities Commission, which has regulatory authority over investor-owned utilities, both electric and gas. And they, of course, oversee a number of regulatory proceedings impacting both systems. And lastly, the CEC, or California Energy Commission, which is the Energy Policy and Planning Agency, and they also implement a number of policies, develop programs, and coordinate with the other two agencies on joint efforts. In addition to the state agencies, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are other relevant regulatory proceedings and/or standard setting activities that are impacting the state efforts, and they touch the building electrification and decarbonization spaces. So being aware of them is not only useful as you navigate implementation at your level, but also may have some opportunities for enhanced coordination and collaboration. And in some cases, grants can help bring these entities together. So just really quickly running through them, the International Code Council is a nonprofit that develops the International Energy Conservation Code, which of course addresses design of energy efficiency in buildings, affecting the building envelope, as well as any of the mechanical, lighting, and power systems. The National Fire Protection Association is a private trade association. They publish the National Fire Code, of which the NEC, or National Electric Code, is a part. And the NEC is a regionally adoptable standard for safe installation of electrical wiring equipment. And the NEC certainly impacts all the electrified components of buildings, but also impacts things like on-site solar and/or energy storage systems. Then, of course, at the federal level, you have the EPA and the DOE, two federal agencies that run the Energy Star program, which sets national standards for and designates energy efficiency products and practices. But these two federal agencies also offer a wealth of resources, programs, information, grants, and training surrounding efficiency, renewables, decarbonization, and electrification. And then lastly, the Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers, or IEEE and UL, are two entities that are responsible for developing the technical requirements and equipment certifications for distributed resources, smart inverters, and energy storage, as well as some HVAC and other electrical equipment. And right now, the implementation of the IEEE 1547 2018 standard is really affecting the solar and smart inverter and energy storage communities. So only a handful of entities to keep track of and understand in this space. So knowing that there are a lot of entities working on various regulatory issues and the standards that touch buildings, it's really, it's difficult to cover them all sufficiently in the time that we have today. And certainly it's difficult for you all in your day-to-day to track all of these. But I'm going to attempt to touch on a handful of the proceedings before both the CPUC and the CEC that are most relevant and merit your attention. And in the end, I'll touch on some thoughts and observations regarding the regulatory environment and in my concluding thoughts. So within the CPUC, there are several active rulemakings that directly or indirectly impact building decarbonization, including the deployment of distributed resources and efficiency. The most prominent, of course, as I'm sure many of you are aware, and some of you are actually involved in, including BayREN, the rulemaking regarding building decarbonization. This, of course, was initiated in response to the passage of SB 1477 and AB 3232. And the scope of this rulemaking includes the implementation of those bills, pilot programs to address new construction in areas damaged by wildfires, coordinating on Title 24 building standards, building energy efficiency standards, and Title 20 appliance efficiency standards, and then establishing a broader building decarbonization policy framework. So phase one, in coordination with the CEC, really focused on the implementation of the $200 million for the build and tech programs. Some of this is being executed through the CEC's building decarbonization docket, and other parts are being executed within the CPUC. In July of 2020, the CEC submitted the implementation plan for build, and then also the Southern California Edison opened a competitive solicitation for the implementation of the tech initiative. The deadline for the bids was, I believe, in August of 2020, and the commission expects to execute a winning contract sometime early 2021. As part of the phase 2, which they're just now getting started, a scoping memo was issued recently, as well as a staff proposal. And the remaining issues to address within phase 2 include, but are not limited to, the layering of incentives of different programs that are touching building decarbonization and how they should be structured. I think this is a super critical issue for a lot of reasons, one of which is to kind of simplify the process. The second is how to specifically devote resources and attention to support construction of decarbonized buildings in the communities that have been affected by the wildfires. And then the third is whether or not there should be a baseline allowance for residential customers who install electric water heating equipment in order to facilitate decarbonization. So I should note the opening comments for the second phase are due October 9th, and there is a proposed decision slated for December 2020, but I will also say that the CPUC is notoriously good at extending deadlines when necessary. Another highly relevant proceeding, and certainly one that is likely to become even more energetic, for lack of a better term, is the kind of the natural gas transition proceeding. And of course, the intent of this one is to develop and adopt updated standards as well as regulations to phase out and or transition natural gas. Some would disagree with me on the phase out terminology, but effectively the commission is going to be looking at a long-term planning strategy to manage the state's transition away from natural gas fueled technologies to meet the state's broader decarbonization goals. And this proceeding is going to be conducted in 3 phases, and the commission will issue a decision following each phase. Next are the trilogy of regulatory proceedings that impact the adoption of distributed energy resources. Namely, Rule 21, which impacts the interconnection process for distributed generators and energy storage. This is a wide-ranging and ever-evolving proceeding that touches on a number of issues, but it's a pretty important one for folks to keep in their purview, because as more distributed generation and storage comes online, the interconnection process can and will become more onerous and or costly if it is not managed well. The second is the NEM successor tariff, which is, of course, impacts the compensation for any customer-sited distributed generation. And this is another one that's been ongoing with many iterations. Back in 2016, the CPUC adopted a successor tariff that effectively continues the same NEM structure as before, but with some adjustments to align costs of NEM customers with non-NEM customers. And many of the stakeholders are now gearing up for the third phase, colloquially known as the NEM 3.0, to determine what future changes for net metering are going to be coming down the pike. The final one is known as the DRP proceeding, which is a more comprehensive proceeding that impacts the planning of the electric distribution grid. And there are several broad implications that we don't really have time to discuss today, but I do think, and flagging for your consideration, that one possible area of future exploration is how all of your local government all electric codes and plans for your individual buildings are, as well as your transportation electrification initiatives, are actually being informing the forecasts as well as the plans for the distribution system within the different California utility territories. I think this is not only true for the electric grid, but also for the gas side. And then finally, the energy efficiency category. While there are a lot of proceedings and tariffs that touch efficiency, this ongoing rulemaking really governs all of the utilities' efficiency programs and their spending. And within this proceeding, a pretty important decision was made earlier this summer, which modifies the energy efficiency 3-prong test, which originally was designed to avoid fuel switching. And now it actually allows for fuel switching and allows for the budget for energy efficiency to be directed towards electrification efforts. There are a bunch of additional issues that are going to be addressed in phase 3 of this proceeding, and likely important to track this one over time, as well as it will in fact impact the availability of resources. So shifting over to the CEC, as you likely know, there's a big effort afoot to now update the building code, or Title 24. And within that, there are going to be a number of updates made to the 2022 building efficiency standards. And these are improvements made about every 3 years on the code for both new construction as well as major alterations to the residential and non-residential buildings. The CEC is right now planning to host and or already hosting workshops to present different revisions and obtain public comment. And those standards will be adopted in 2021 with an effective date of 2023, January 1. Also, of course, notably and important for your purposes is that the Energy Code also currently includes a voluntary reach tier as well as model language for local governments. And I believe many of you have already utilized and or plan to utilize this model language as part of your efforts. So within the energy efficiency and building decarbonization docket, the CEC recently issued the 2019 Energy Efficiency Action Plan. And in describing the plan in CEC's words, they said, quote, "This plan reflects a renewed promise of and a commitment to efficiency, both as a traditional common sense energy management strategy and as an active dynamic grid resource. Buildings are the platform for integrating demand side services and other DERs alongside all utility resources, generating value in a coherent way from the customer upward." I pull that out as a really important quote because I feel like we're often focused so much on the electricity planning components and the electricity programs and really fail to make that bridge and the connection back to the actual space where those programs are implemented, which is effectively buildings. And as I mentioned before, this is the same docket where the CEC and CPUC are coordinating on build and tech. And then lastly, just to flag, I'm sure you're aware of this, but the Energy Conservation Act the CEC under this act does administer 1% low interest loans for public entities, including cities and counties, special districts, public colleges, etc. And then they also have 0 interest loans for schools. They're both offered to finance efficiency and energy generation projects, and the maximum loan is $3 million. And although there are other regulatory efforts afoot that impact building decarbonization, these seem to be the most relevant to, keep track of, engage in, and or be aware of as you proceed with your respective local efforts and municipal decarbonization efforts.
1 minute left.
Thanks, perfect timing. This is my last slide. So yes, a lot of moving parts to coordinate to get the sides of the Rubik's Cube to align. And in conclusion, I'll just offer a few takeaways. So these regulatory spaces are governed by extensive rules of engagement and protocols, and the key to being effective is understanding the process. It's all of it a bit esoteric, so if you don't know, ask or work with your attorneys or attorneys who specialize in these regulatory arenas to guide your engagement. Secondly, within and among these spaces, more cross-sector collaboration is definitely needed to ensure that one head of the multi-headed California bureaucracy is talking to the other. And as the state works to implement their state policies, it's super important for the local governments and communities to be really hand in hand with the state efforts. Otherwise, there will be a divergence and or perpetual regulatory lag. Similarly, the implementers and policy end users should be involved in helping to shape the policies and rules. There's a multitude of stakeholders within the building sector that have never engaged in electric regulation or gas regulation. And we need to start making those bridges to ensure that policy is responsive to and reflective of real world conditions. Your voice is probably the most important, as I've said. Again, I want to commend BayREN as well as many of the other local governments that have been involved in regulatory discussions. Historically, your voice has been absent and or underrepresented. So I'm excited to see that there are more folks engaging and getting involved. And then lastly, I really would love more emphasis placed on the finance piece as well as the funding and incentives, but particularly finance for public sector, I think it gets often overlooked. I'm sure you all would agree, but there are some very innovative things happening not only in California, but across the country that might be good to take a look at in terms of starting to put all these Rubik's Cube sides together. So with that, I will conclude my remarks. Happy to answer any questions and looking forward to moderating the next panel and exploring these topics further. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I think we're right at our break now. So, we're doing the poll. Denise, did you want to talk about the poll? Denise, you're on mute still. Oh, I see you have an alarm going off. Okay, can you go ahead and launch the poll, Nadia or Edgar, and then we'll have that up and open while we go off to our 15-minute break. Okay, so there are actually 3 questions in the poll. The first one is, what would help your agency make progress toward decarbonizing your existing public buildings? What is the status of your agency's policy development regarding decarbonizing existing buildings? And what is the status of your agency's effort to implement decarbonization practices in existing buildings? So if while you're on the break, everyone can fill in that poll, and then if you can come back right at 10:45. Thank you again, Sarah, for your presentation. I think we can cover questions to that in the questions with the panelists in the next section too.
Yep,
Thank you,
no
everybody.
problem.